bad feeling about this. What happened here? And where are all the Hammerites?
After nearly 30 years of playing video games, I think I've developed a decent eye for good, honest games. Although that's subjective, I define a good game as one that makes you go, yeah, I enjoy playing that. For me, sometimes they're sandbox-style games like Kenshi or Mountain Blade, which excel at creating player-driven narratives at the expense of internal story. Sometimes they're role-playing games with deep lore and rich stories at the expense of janky controls like Fallout 2, Planescape Torment, Baldur's Gate 2, and Gothic, which were all integral to my childhood and formative years. Sometimes they're strategy games like StarCraft or Crusader Kings, and sometimes they're honest-to-goodness shooters like Quake, Doom, Wolfenstein, or hell, even Halo. Games that define many of our childhoods, or games that, well, maybe you didn't play, people you know look back on with misty eyes. I bring this up because in recent years my hunger for these kinds of games has gone relatively unsatiated. Not to say that there have been no games that have scratched this itch for me, but it seems that the games that define my youth are apparently less in demand than the ever-nauseating games as a service. The push from single to multiplayer, a confusing and frightening one to my old gamer brain, which wishes nothing more than to roleplay quietly in his living room as a low-intelligent himbo traipsing across the wasteland, rather than get yelled at by teenagers because I don't know how to pre-fire or boost. As a result, I've found myself dipping back further into the past to relive some of that childhood glory, to look back on my youth and enjoy the familiar. This has recently been a more encompassing endeavor as I find myself playing fewer modern releases, sometimes all but ignoring them, and instead revisiting games I know I enjoy like Morrowind, Chrono Trigger, Half-Life, or Age of Empires 2. There are, of course, exceptions to all these broad-stroke claims of modern gaming mediocrity. Not all new games are bad, but anyone could say as much. The potential is even there for more of them to be better than just okay, but it seems, to me anyway, that more and more games just are. Their features stripped down, streamlined, overly explained, and unimaginative, or rather formulaic. Safe, I guess you'd call them. Neither impressive nor disappointing, they exist in a vacuum of inoffensive and unimpressive blandness to meet quarterly numbers while ignoring general artistry or creativity for profit. In all seriousness, though, there are still great games being released every year. Games like Divinity Original Sin 2, Elden Ring, Disco Elysium, and God of War immediately come to mind, just to name a few. There are also many brilliant independent releases like Kenshi, Valheim, or, as recently played on the channel, Blood West that have all, for me anyway, kept the spirit of the past alive. A reminder that, to some developers, the good old days never left. In fact, they're just getting started. But looking back on these olden days has me thinking, what about games that I never played as a kid? If I'm looking back anyway, shouldn't I dust off the unknown and peek inside and see what's there? I never had the best PC growing up, and I couldn't afford to build my first gaming computer until I was well into my 20s. So for a long stretch of the late 90s into the early 2010s, my desire and draw to play games was often relegated to reading about them in magazines or playing them at a friend's house. As such, I didn't get to play the Deus Exes, the Stalkers, or the System Shocks when they released. But in the years since, I've made it my goal to go back and experience these games for myself, to decide whether I thought people were looking at them objectively or through the rose-tinted lenses of memory. Recently, I've played games like Arx Fatalis and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines on this channel, and while both have impressed me to some capacity, I would be lying if I said they didn't have major issues. Recently, for a new Let's Play on the channel, I decided to explore another classic, Thief 2, which I bought on sale years ago but never played. But playing the sequel to a game I played maybe one level of as a kid at a friend's house felt kinda wrong and left me curious about the Dark Project, now almost exclusively available as the definitive Thief Gold. I wondered, does it hold up? Is it worth playing? The 1998 immersive sim that defined the stealth genre from legendary Looking Glass Studios and named synonymous with gaming royalty seems to me a game ripe for exploring. Though Looking Glass has passed into legend, as have their two stealth games whose sequels, from what I understand, were increasingly disappointing to fans of the originals, I feel compelled to explore what made this game the genre-defining thing that it is. Therefore, I set out here in episode 1 of what will hopefully become a new series of videos to discover if this nearly 24-year-old game passes the test of greatness, or is better left in the past. So, without further ado, my name is Olaf, and this is Beyond Nostalgia. Before we begin properly, I'd just like to say that this is not a retrospective. I will not be discussing the inner workings of Looking Glass Studio, their history, or the development and impact of Thief on the gaming world beyond a surface level. The goal of this video is not to talk about legacy, but rather if you should play the game. There are many other YouTubers far more skilled than I who have discussed the legacy and impact of this game and the genre on the gaming community. Thief Gold puts players in the shoes of Garrett, a sarcastic and often cynical master thief who grew up an orphan and spent his youth learning to hide in the shadows and take without being seen in order to survive. The world of Thief and subsequent games takes place in the Eternal City, which is essentially a steampunk D&D style fantasy world with some horror elements sprinkled throughout. Players will find themselves in grand temples, concert halls, haunted crypts, and unspeakable places of eldritch madness. The story begins with young Garrett attempting to pick the wrong pocket, that of Artemis, a thief belonging to the order known as the Keepers. Artemis, catching Garrett but impressed he could even see him, adopts Garrett, so to speak, and trains him in the way of the Keepers, which is represented as the game's tutorial, while players will learn how to sneak, which is done via sticking to the shadows and paying attention to the light gem at the bottom of the screen, fighting, which you generally want to avoid as Garrett is not meant to fight unless absolutely necessary, and climbing, something you'll be doing a lot of throughout Thief's 20 or so hours of gameplay, even if the mechanic for that is admittedly a little janky. The tutorial does do a fairly good job of explaining the game's main mechanics while still leaving much for the player to discover on their own, such as the use of many of Thief's gadgets like flash bombs, holy water, or moss arrows, or that an alerted civilian can be knocked out regularly but an alerted guard or creature will have to be struck from behind a few times, ran away from, or just plainly killed. Now, admittedly, a lot of items or mechanics are self-explanatory or explained in context throughout the missions you find them in, but it's nice that Looking Glass trusted players enough to figure some things out for themselves. I do wish the game would have explained lockpicks a little better and earlier, only because of how important they will be throughout your playthrough, but you do get a piece of paper discussing their use when you unlock them, so I guess it's fine. I'd have just preferred it in the tutorial personally. Anyway, something that will jump out to most new players, because it jumped out to me, are Thief's controls, which are kind of annoying, at least by default. Admittedly, this doesn't bother me as much as I know it will other people, but it still took me about 20 minutes to configure them in a way that felt modern-ish. Normally, I wouldn't be so kind towards bad controls, but really it's just a product of its time. Gothic almost immediately comes to mind as a game I enjoy, but also suffers from terrible controls. This is mainly because games of this era only really required the keyboard, mouse support being secondary in a lot of cases. Thankfully, there are some preset configurations within the setting, which makes the job a little bit easier, plus it doesn't take that long to get used to the controls. Although I'm not positive and could be completely wrong, I believe these settings for the pre-existing control configurations exist because of the T-Fix patch, which is, from what I understand, essential to playing Thief 1 or 2 on modern hardware. Players looking for a more vanilla experience can simply install the patches and fixes, but I opted for the built-in texture improvements as well and didn't notice anything egregiously out of place in that regard. I try to keep most of my first runs of a game vanilla-friendly, and from what I've read, T-Fix alone is a good way to do that. My own perspective aside, Thief will feel a little awkward even with these changes. More than a few times I found myself looking up the command for or changing one as I went along. Sometimes Garrett just seemed to stop or get stuck in the ground after running or would clip into a wall, forcing a reload. The combat is clunky and Garrett is incredibly weak, which will become jarringly apparent in the late game. That said, controls and gameplay can be learned and adjusted to. If the gameplay itself, or rather the general loop and world design were bad, that would be different, but it's not, and we'll get to that shortly. But before we leave settings, I'd like to briefly say that I recommend players play this game with headphones and gamma turned down a little bit. The shadows look much more believable when below default, and the lighting and shadow design was one of the main selling points of this game in the first place, so I think taking advantage of those devices is important. Likewise, the sound design is unmatched, even by a lot of modern standards, and cannot be fully appreciated through computer speakers alone. Footsteps, whistling, conversations, creaking floorboards, moaning zombies, yes zombies, crackling fires, and snoring citizens all come together perfectly to create a fantastically immersive experience if you allow it to. The soundtrack, likewise, when used, is perfectly ambient and fits each location brilliantly. Honestly, there are a few games I've played with as much focus and detail sound-wise, and it would be a shame for someone to miss out on that because they didn't use headphones. With that out of the way, let's talk a little more about the story and missions themselves after one more quick sidebar. Players should keep in mind that while Thief Gold was released less than a year after the Dark Project, it is still different in several ways. Gold has 16 missions total, 3 of which have been added from the original, those being numbers 6, 9, and 11, respectively. It's also worth noting that missions 6, Thieves Guild, and 9, the Mage's Tower, are both fairly tedious and frustrating, at least in my opinion, with the former often considered the worst in the game by the community, and the latter filled with a lot of gamey feeling platforming and puzzle solving. That said though, Mission 11, Songs of the Cavern, is probably one of my favorites in the game, and is a brilliant bait and switch that lines up almost perfectly with the mission before it. Lastly, players should know that they can always skip a mission they don't care for with the in-game command of Shift plus Control plus Alt plus End, should they end up in the Thieves Guild and decide that they don't feel like bothering with it because it really doesn't tie into the main story all that much. On top of new levels, there are additional enemy types in Gold, Fire Shadows and Hand Mages, which make appearances in various missions, with Fire Shadows being considerably rare. There were also some texture changes to certain missions, storyline changes, and expansions to certain areas, giving the definitive version of Thief roughly 4 to 5 hours of additional content. Although I didn't look particularly hard into it, it seems to me that the only way to play the original 1998 version these days would be on disc, which you can patch with things like tfix to get it running the same as the Steam or GOG version. That, or you can use the mod Gold to Dark, which removes the additional levels, but from what I've read, not the other changes made by Gold, so use it at your own discretion. Anyway, let's get back to it. In each of Thief's 16 missions, players are given an overview of their objective via a small cutscene, which will usually be preceded by a quote from a book by either the Hammerites, or the Keepers, or maybe even the Fanatics. Each overview is narrated usually by Garrett, who is voiced by Stephen Russell, who many players will recognize as Nick Valentine from Fallout 4, and get used to his voice because on top of hearing Garrett's intros and in-game comments, he voices what to me felt like over half of the game's characters anyway. Not saying that's a bad thing though, because a lot of the side chatter is quite entertaining and Russell does a great job along with the rest of the cast of making the world feel alive and unique. Thief's missions vary broadly from I need money to pay rent to I need to find and steal magical talismans in order to steal an ancient artifact from a sealed haunted cathedral for my mysterious and potentially dangerous benefactor. Yeah, it's pretty intense. Sometimes quests will feel random, as if the maps were made before the story, which is likely true because the game wasn't originally going to be a stealth game at all, and instead was going to take place in Camelot and be more of a dark fantasy game with occasional stealth missions. But other times they line up perfectly and make more sense narratively. For each mission, you are given a map, which will vary greatly in detail and quality depending on who gave it to you. Sometimes Garrett has to form the maps himself, or through hearsay, and it'll be a little rough. Other times you get a fairly detailed layout, and it makes the missions much smoother. Back to narration though, some missions do run into one another and form a more cohesive narrative, while others are more standalone. Although it's worth noting that these standalone missions tend to taper off around the halfway point of the game. Regardless, sometimes you do things on your own, sometimes you go through other people, and sometimes you're thrown into the jaws of chaos, and the only way out is through. Each mission can be assigned a difficulty of normal, hard, or expert, with each setting corresponding to new objectives, harder AI, more numerous enemies, and different map layouts. For example, someone playing on normal will have more avenues to their target, and sometimes more loot, whereas on expert, shortcuts and loot are deleted, guards are increased, and the AI is made more aware of your presence by either opening doors or the sound of your footsteps. For my part, I typically played on hard, with a couple missions on expert when I wanted more of a challenge, but I'm admittedly not that great at this game. Thankfully, there's a quick save feature so you can save scum like me every 10 seconds to avoid restarts. Plus, there was usually only small variation in objectives between hard and expert anyway, so I didn't feel like I was missing out too much. For comparison though, normal felt way too easy, so I only did one mission on it before going back to the others. Money, which you acquire from stealing anything that isn't nailed down, carries over from previous missions when you get to load screens, which give you the option to buy more equipment for the coming mission, such as more arrows, potions, or even tips. Personally, I never bothered to buy any of the tips, but I highly recommend stocking your loadout as much as possible, when you're given the option anyway. You aren't always. Levels are designed to encourage exploration and are actually quite detailed for the time. There are mysteries, side characters who pop up with hilarious conversations, and avenues that you could easily miss out on if you're not diligent. Sometimes extra objectives can be a little tricky or require extra steps to find, but the internet has decades of guides, videos, and forums to surf through to help you if you get stuck. Which you probably will because some of the secrets are almost impossible to find, at least they were for me. But again, I'm not great at this game, so that could be why. Although you could argue it starts at Mission 1, Thief's story technically begins at Mission 7, The Sword, when players begin interacting with the mysterious figure known as Constantine, which will lead Garrett down a path of collecting talismans for some pretty crazy magical shenanigans at the end of the game. I won't spoil the story beyond that should you decide to try the game out for yourself. But overall, I thought it was a great time, aside from when I got stuck on a couple missions due to confusing layouts or accidentally quick saving as I was falling to my death. Also, the last few missions are fairly short and linear and felt a little out of place compared to some of the larger levels like the Lost City or the Haunted Cathedral. But honestly, the gameplay more than makes up for a few mediocre levels or frequent player error. Thief is a blast to play, and it's not hard to see why. The loop of getting objectives, picking your loadout, infiltrating the area, skulking for loot, and extracting your goods is wildly appealing and addictive. It's the reason games like Escape from Tarkov, The Hunt Showdown, and Dark and Darker exist. People like going in, fighting for their life, and getting out. Granted, you won't or shouldn't be fighting as much in Thief, but this loop is probably why Thief 1 and 2 have enjoyed years of fan-made maps and mods, some of which go above and beyond the quality of the base game at this point. All that said, I think it's time we reach our conclusion, which you can probably guess at this point. Thief Gold is absolutely worth checking out, but with the caveat that the late game does taper in quality from the beginning and the middle. While I enjoyed some of the set pieces of the last few missions, they were usually more frustrating and enjoyable in concept than in practice. But honestly, the twist did get me, and I found the story compelling enough to recommend it. I know many of you aren't surprised by this, but I wasn't certain when I started playing that I'd come to this conclusion. I've played 2 older immersive sims for the first time within the last year, which I mentioned earlier in this video, and both left middling tastes in my mouth, with one in particular, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, having an ending so poorly done that I hesitate to even play it again. Arx Fatalis, however, is a lot of fun when you get the hang of it, but the story is the game, and the story is meh. Thief thankfully relies far more on being a fun game to play, and never takes itself too seriously, which is why it's become one of my new favorites that I could see myself coming back to again and again. So there you have it. Thief Gold, the monumental immersive sim that defined a genre, goes beyond nostalgia, and gets our first pass of the series. I have some ideas for the next game, but I think I'll put it up to a vote. There's a lot to play out there and a lot to see. Time will tell whether they too live up to the hype. But thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, as it helps my small channel grow and lets me know you enjoy videos like this. I prefer doing things like this that challenge me creatively, and it's nice to know they're appreciated. Have you played Thief before? What missions did you like? Let me know in the comments. But anyway, that's going to be it for this one. I'm Olaf, this has been Beyond Nostalgia, Episode 1, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.
I spy you, little fish. Oh no, it's a big fish, rather. Are you here to sing too? We'll reenact the memorable scene between Raoul and Valerius at the bridge. I'll begin. The city at night. Raoul, the handsome, young opera house owner, sings to the Lady Valerius. I, Raoul, do accuse you of using treachery to obtain your wealth. Then Lady Valerius sings, I, Lady Valerius, have obtained the opera house, yes. Right from under your nose, you must kiss the ground underneath my toes.